Thank you very much for joining our session. We have a light topic for you today, which deals with, the tensions and the changing relationship between Israel and world Jewry. My name is Netaly Ophir Flint. For those of you who don't know me, until recently I was the executive director of an organization called the Reut Group. Reut is a nonprofit, for lack of a better word, I'm going to say think in a do tank, which is based in Tel Aviv, whose mission is to help Israel and the Jewish world make progress on some of its most challenging problems that they have. We do it on a wide range of issues, but the one that's relevant to our work here is what we've been doing on the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. So we'll start in a minute. We have one panelist who's on his way, Jonathan Kessler, and he's going to join us very shortly, stuck in traffic. I'd like to introduce our other panelists. We have Sam Grundwerg. Yeah, I got it. Who is the Consul General of Israel in Los Angeles. Rachel Chafetz, who is an IAC board member from Boston. Jonathan Kessler, who's going to join us in a second, who heads strategic projects for AIPAC. And Gil Preuss, who is the executive director of Federation of Greater Washington. And so, like I said, the title of this session is called Mind the Gap and deals with the relationship that's changing between Israel and world Jewry. And just to start us off, we want to just see a little bit about who is in the room and engage the audience. So I'm going to ask you guys two questions. And I'll ask that before you answer, first kind of answer to yourself, right? So jot it down or remember it in your head or write it on your phone. And then I'll ask you to stand up with the answer that you most identify with, okay? So question number one. When you think of Jewish communities outside of Israel, what word do you most identify with? Diaspora, Tfutzot, Gola, or other? Okay? Everyone think of their answer. People who most identify with the word diaspora, stand up. Yeah, just stand up, just so that we see.
You know what the words mean? Can you define the Hebrew words?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the fact that you don't know what the Hebrew words are means that you don't identify with it. We'll define them in a second, but thank you. Okay. Tfutzot. Who identifies with the word tfutzot? Tfutzot is the Hebrew word for dispersion. Okay? How about Gola? Who identifies with the word Gola? Gola, literally the translation is exile. It's used to refer to people who, have left their home. And what about other? Okay, so somebody who said other. What's another word that you use? Okay, so when you think of Jewish communities that live outside of Israel, the word that you identify with or that comes to mind is Orthodox.
I thought about that for Los Angeles.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
I thought diaspora, but because you use the term identify, I assume you mean personal identification versus your own understanding.
Got it. Okay, and it's not a scientific study. We just wanted to show a little bit of the diversity in the room, right? Whether you personally identify or that's the word that you associate with. Second question. Ready? When you heard of the Kotel Compromise exploding, what was the reaction that you felt? Anger, relief, indifference, or you've never heard of the Kotel Compromise? Who felt Anger, stand up.
Can I add a word?
Sure. Betrayal. That's even stronger than anger. Okay. Who felt relief? Indifference? Don't be shy, guys. It's a closed room. Except for the camera, nobody's watching. Or I've never heard of the Kotel Compromise. Okay, fair enough. Great. Thank you for participating. Again, not a scientific study, but I think that what the diversity of the answers here shows a little bit of the complexity of the relationship, right? We have some people who feel betrayal around issues of progressive Judaism and how Israel reacts to that, and we have some people who've either never heard of it or are completely indifferent to it. It shows the spectrum of the complexity, and that's what we wanted to portray. So in a minute, I'm going to ask our panelists a few questions and to get their responses. But just in order to frame the issue, I want to share a little bit of our interpretation in terms of the research that we did at Reut of the problem, a diagnosis of the problem. And we don't have time to really get into all of the details, so I'll do it very briefly. And what I will say is that we've identified what is called a very significant relevancy gap around the area of Israel's role as the nation state of the Jewish people. Okay, so what's a relevancy gap? First, let's define it. A relevancy gap is a situation where decision makers, leaders, entire societies have a certain mindset about reality, certain paradigm. They create their policies, their modes of behavior, their actions based on that mindset, that paradigm. Over time, reality shifts, oftentimes making their policies irrelevant, right? Happens to all of us all the time. What's the relevancy gap that we've identified in the relationship between Israel and world Jewry? Essentially, the relevancy gap is that for many people in Israel, and when I say for many people in Israel, I mean everything from government officials all the way to people on the street. When we talk about their mindset, for most people in Israel, they believe that Israel serves as the nation state, Medinat HaLe'om, the nation state of the Jewish people. However, we've been seeing that significant trends have been undermining that, and that in reality, many Jews outside of Israel are feeling more distance towards Israel, and therefore is that status of Israel as the nation state is eroding. And I'll give 3 examples or 3 line items of that. So, the first is that for most people in Israel, the mindset is, hi Jonathan, welcome. We've introduced you, so you come on in and join us. So, for most people in Israel, the mindset is that even with all the complexities and even though Israel is not perfect, Israel has been and still is an asset for the Jewish people. However, the reality is that when we talk to many Jews that live outside of Israel, Israel has become a divisive issue, a politicized issue, and support for Israel has political consequences and social consequences. We're even seeing rabbis in congregations who are trying to avoid it, the issue of Israel so as not to polarize the people. Second example. For many Israelis, they believe that the original purposes upon which Israel was founded still hold strong significance for Jews that live out of Israel. So for example, one of those purposes is the whole idea of Israel as a safe haven, and that Jews can always make Aliyah to Israel. But the reality is, for most of the Jews, Aliyah is just not relevant anymore on the agenda. And so we're seeing that distancing. And third example is that in Israel, there are many topics that Israelis see as internal Israeli issues. I'm talking about things such as separation of, or lack of separation of state and religion. issues of the way that Israel treats its minorities. Those are internal Israeli issues. But for many Jews living outside of Israel, we're seeing that those issues have significant bearings on their day-to-day life and is affecting the way that they're seeing Israel. And so the bottom line is that this relevancy gap is eroding Israel's role, its ability to serve as the nation state for the entire Jewish people. And so if trends continue, we're going in this direction as opposed to this direction. So that's the problem, at least one interpretation, a diagnosis of the problem. The good news is that a lot can be done and is being done in order to try and bridge that gap, and that's a lot of what we want to focus on today. And so I want to pass it now on to our distinguished panelists. And the first question to you all is, how do you understand the problem? Is there really a gap as I've described it? Is it maybe not as strong? And what's your take from your experience? Gil, why don't you start?
Thank you. So I guess what I'd like to do, I'd like to put it in context. Some people have heard Avram Infeld and a variety of things, and he's coming out with a book, but I'm not here to sell his book. The thing that I find relevant that can help structure the conversation is his framework when he talks about the 5 legs to the table that kind of brings together the Jewish community. And he talks about memory, or a common memory. He talks about a sense of family, kind of Mount Sinai, which I more interpret as a common future destiny, land of Israel, and Hebrew. And so if you think about these 5 things that could possibly bind kind of global Jewry together to have a sense of a common past and common future, in each one of these 5 areas, there's actually increasing separation between Israel and American Jewry. So whether you think about Hebrew as a common language, right? Is that a common language between American Jews and Israelis anymore? If you think about the deep connection to the land of Israel and the country of Israel and building the state there, do we have a common role? Do we even have a common memory of the past, of what brought us to where we are? For a lot of Americans, it's a very different memory and set of historical facts and narrative that we give ourselves in terms of what led to our current state. And when we think about the future, do we have a common destiny? And so when we think about where we're going in the future, so if you look at these different components that could either bind us together as a single people and help us think where we are, that we are absolutely joined together, or distinct, in each one of them, I think we are facing increasing challenges across the geographic divides. And so the question that we have to be thinking about is, how do we address those divides in those distinct areas? We can point to a variety of different facts, right? So we could talk about disagreement in terms of what happens with a kotel or conversion, or we can talk about disagreement on Israeli government policies or a variety of other things. But to a certain extent, I think that those are the for lack of a better term, the surface factors that come up and that reflect an underlying deeper change that we have to confront. And it's not simply by having a better compromise in terms of what happens with the kotel or on all these other issues, but unless we can confront those core issues about common memory of the past, language, connection to Israel, sense of the common future, then we won't be able to bridge the divide. In the past, we didn't have as many of those things, and we had a certain relationship. And so that is kind of at the core what I think, if I were to think about the gap and where we're going, something that we need to confront as we go forward.
Thanks. Rachel, what do you think?
Not as deep and not as much as Gil. Pretty much very easy. I think, yes, there's a gap, and yes, the gap is definitely growing. I have to say up front, unlike the very distinct panelists next to me, I'm not a professional. I'm a lay leader. I do what I do because I believe what needs to be done, not because of any other reason. Not that I have any problem with your reasons.
They don't pay us that much money.
It's not only that they don't pay me, it actually costs me. So I just wanted you to know.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. So yes, I see a gap, but I see it. I see it from my own personal life. I see what the gap was. The relation between Israel and the diaspora Jews in the times of my in-laws who are American, and versus the relation today with my own kids. It's day and night. It's not even existing. And I'll get into more details if the time permits and if you want to hear. But I could see throughout the years, I've been here for a little bit over 20 years, and I could see every year it's getting worse and less care by the young generation for the state of Israel. And the gap is coming from both ways. It's not just that the American Jews has a tear and a problem with Israel. It's the Israeli that has very little education and knowledge about what the purpose and the importance of the American Jews. So yes, to your question, there is a gap, and it's growing, and it's scary, and we're here to do something.
I'm glad we have some optimists in this group. Consul General, what's your take?
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Netaly, for having me, and fellow panelists, and thank you to everybody participating. I'm hoping that I can offer a unique perspective, first of all, as an official representative of Israel, as Israel's representative to the Southwest United States, but also as someone who is American-born and raised, lived about almost 30 years in this country, mostly in South Florida, and about 15 years in Israel. And so, while I am here speaking in my capacity as an Israeli diplomat, I want to share my perspective also as somebody who understands at least American Jewry pretty well. And I think, as you started, I think putting this issue into the proper context and the proper proportion is very important. Because on the one hand, there's certainly an issue. Anybody who says that there's no issue is simply ignoring that. But I also think that the sky is not falling. It's important to understand that, I think a lot of times we find ourselves naturally thinking that the situation that we're in is the most dire and that it's unprecedented and it's never been the case before. It's true that there are a lot of nuances, and I'll get into why I think there are nuances in the, and here language is very important also. Language is always very important. I also used to be a lawyer in a former life, and language is very important. They always taught us that, and it's true. So when we talk about, even in framing a conversation like this, rifts and crisis, and I'm not saying to sugarcoat things, but we have to be careful, I think. And there are a lot of leaders here, not just around this table, but in this room, and I'm speaking to myself as well. We have to be careful when we use certain language, that give the impression that the sky is falling. I don't know that I agree with crises and rifts. I mean, again, I'm not belittling, and we can get into the specifics of the Kotel issue and the conversion bill. But a lot of these issues have been around long before this Kotel issue, and certainly since the beginning of the State of Israel. And again, that's not to belittle it, but we have to understand in the proper perspective. For as long as I can remember, as somebody, a Zionist growing up in the United States, there's always this question and tension of how much say should the Jewish voice, the Jewish communities outside of Israel have in decisions that are made in Israel and Israeli policy? So how much say should they have, on what issues exactly, and how? And by the way, I applaud the work that the Reut group is doing. I've looked at the report and the different suggestions, and we could talk about that as well. And so that's always a push and pull, this question, and I'm confronted with it all the time when I meet with leaders in my region, in the Southwest, begging that the Israeli leadership take into account in decisions that we make the impact on the Jewish community outside. And certainly, I agree that that should be the case. It's simply a question of practically how much and on what issues. So first of all, context is very important. I believe that, not only is the state of Israel maturing as we reach 70 years soon, but also the idea of the Jewish communities in the diaspora and the Golan, the Tfutzot, whatever we want to call it, is also maturing. As you mentioned, Netaly, it used to be about aliyah, it used to be about immigration, it used to be about having a safe haven. Now, putting Europe aside, looking at the United States, things have changed. And I think also, if you think about it, if you're 75 or older, unless you're 75 or older, I should say, you don't remember a world without the state of Israel in it. And if you're not 55 or older, you don't remember a vulnerable Israel. And so I think what's happening is that Israel is maturing as a country. We're certainly, of course, still in a very unstable and dangerous neighborhood, but we're a lot stronger, we're a lot more stable. And the communities in the United States, the Jewish communities, have also evolved. And so I think that there's a maturity or maturation process that's taking place. And the truth is, if you think about it, it was kind of easy, right, in the 60s, before and before the Yom Kippur War, to have a relationship with Israel as a vulnerable Israel. And I think what's happening is, as Israel has become stronger and more independent, and the relationship with a strong Israel has to evolve as well. It's a different kind of a relationship, and it's a more complex relationship. And I agree very much with what Rachel mentioned about the issue of familiarity in education. And maybe we'll get into this more, I know, when you want to hear about what can be done. But I think on an optimistic note, just to end on an optimistic note, I think first of all, we've seen, just like everything else, all relationships are tested during times of crisis. And I think what we've seen is, despite again, if you want to call this a rift, or the vibrant debate on these issues, and there should be, I think we've seen that despite all of that, during times of crisis, the relationship remains strong and tested and is strong. We saw that in 2014 during Protective Edge, and we've seen that time and time again, that despite these issues and these very personal and very sensitive debates, that when it's crunch time and times of crisis, that the solidarity from the Jewish communities and beyond the Jewish community also. We have a number of people here from Passages who will talk about that also, about how the non-Jewish programs together with Birthright can also address this issue. And so, I think that there's optimism in terms of, we've seen that in times of crisis, and I think that with programs to help familiarity on both sides, on the Israeli community to better understand what the Jewish communities in the Tfutzot are all about. There's so many stories of Israelis who have never seen a reform siddur or a conservative siddur, or to know what a prayer service in a conservative or reform synagogue is like. And so that's important. And of course, the other way for American progressive Jews to understand why it seems, at least, that this whole idea of pluralism doesn't seem to be as high on the priority list as it is here. So I'll end there.
So thank you. Jonathan, you mentioned before, you're the Director of Strategic Initiatives at AIPAC. You've been working with young Jews for many years now. What's your take? Is it a big problem, or as the Consul General is alluding to, it's a problem, but it's a small problem?
I didn't say it's a small problem.
It's not as optimistic.
Well, first, I'm so delighted to be here. I'm so delighted I got here in time. They've closed off all the streets around the convention center, and I had to run the last quarter mile. I'm delighted to be here, but I am not speaking on behalf of AIPAC in this particular session, on this particular topic, because I think, as you know, AIPAC focuses very, very narrowly, and one of the areas that we all have opinions on, but AIPAC will never have a position on, per se, is the question of whether there's a gap growing or diminishing between Israel and the diaspora. There are lots of other thought leaders who do focus on this. I've had to focus on this for the reasons you've indicated. I've been involved with young people since I was a young person, which is more than 40 years. Look, relationships are tricky. All relationships, as it turns out, are tricky. My first question is, how many of you would marry somebody you've never met? How many of you would marry somebody that you've only spent 10 days with, like Birthright, 10 days with? Are we best friends forever? Are we friends with benefits? Are we friends in a Facebook sense? There is a rift. I don't think it's a crisis, but I think that the rift is significantly wider than it was in the 1980s, and I can confidently predict that within 10 years, it will be virtually insurmountable. It's not a crisis today. It will be a crisis in 10 years. By the way, not a new phenomenon. A good friend of mine, Joyce Starr, wrote a book about this subject in 1990. She called it Kissing Through Glass, which when you think about it is like the intimation of intimacy with no real intimacy, kissing through glass. And she was focusing primarily on the fact that American Jews did not know Israel, primarily because they didn't know Israelis. But I think it would be a terrible mistake to assume that because of the fabulous success of Birthright, Americans, or even American Jews, or even American Jewish young people now know Israel. But the issue that I'm focusing on is actually the corollary. The dangerous phenomenon of Israelis not knowing America, not knowing American Jewry, not knowing American politics, and the most dangerous phenomenon of them all, Israelis who know nothing about Congress, assuming they do understand the intricacies. There was once a time when Israel had leaders that had such intimate relationships with American Jewish leaders that they really knew this community. I mean, Teddy Kollek knew this community in a way that nobody on the scene, and I'm talking prime ministers, ambassadors, just generically, they just don't know. And they think they know. And it's very, very disconcerting. Fortunately, ministers that I've dealt with lately who don't speak English particularly well have admitted that they're bewildered by Congress and the political process in the United States. That's good, right? That's a good starting point. So while we focus a lot on getting Americans, especially young people, Jews, and especially non-Jews who are just beginning to form their perceptions, their passions, their preoccupations to spend time in Israel, and AIPAC does it and endorses the expansion of this among dozens of organizations, I wonder why there isn't more effort being spent on getting first members of Knesset to spend serious, immersive time here, and then the future generations of Israeli political leaders, why they aren't required or strongly encouraged to spend serious time here as well. I'm aware of the programs that do exist, and later maybe you'll tease out of me a recommendation that the programs that do exist be expanded very dramatically.
Thank you. Our time is running short, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for a conversation with the audience. So I'm going to ask to combine the last two questions and for you to address both of them at once, which is, what is, okay, so given that we all agree that there is a challenge, right? We can argue on the extent of the challenge, but there is a challenge. Given that, what is your vision for the future of the relationship? Where are we going? And what are some practical things that can be done and that you are doing, each one of you respectively, kind of with your hat, in order to help us kind of bridge that gap? Rachel, would you like to start?
So, what do I see in 10 years? I'm like, you're very pessimistic. I don't know what I see. But for me, the vision is to start bridging between the communities. Open the channel of communication and do what we do best as Israelis, is talk. Totally. I think I'm representing the Israeli-American Council, and I'm so happy and honored to see all those young people that actually care about what will happen. So thank you, first of all, for coming here. And I think the way to do it is exactly what the ISC is doing right now, is by creating programs that will be combining the Israeli community and what they bring, which is the Israeliness and the spirit, and the Jewish community and what they bring to the Israeliness, which is the idea of being Jewish. We are losing our people. We don't know who we are anymore. So we need each other we need to enrich each other's life. And the bottom line and the long-term purpose of all of that should be one thing and one thing only: Israel. And the ISC is doing it the best. I mean, between doing program for teens, leadership and entrepreneurship, which is Israeli and American, opening social media rooms. I'm very proud to say that. The relationship between the IC in Boston and the Federation, and Aviva is here, of creating such an unusual and incredible tool for people to support and be there for Israel. This is the way to do. So it's engaging, it's educating, it's bringing communities together, it's bridging between what we never thought can be bridged. And yes, I'm a little bit more optimistic, but I'm also a person of what we call in Hebrew, tachlis. You get up and you do. You don't talk, you don't question, you don't ask, you don't do research, you just do. The ISC is tachlis. The ISC is doing. So I'm not going to get into more details, but the only thing I want to say is that Boston is really an unusual place because we have an unbelievable federation and an unbelievable head of federation and a former VP of the federation who moved to Washington and broke my heart to pieces. And we have lay leadership
She will never
that care.
forgive you, Gil.
Never. And we have lay leadership that care. So when you have people that come to the table and they don't looking to hurt each other, they're not looking to fight with each other, they're not looking to see where each other can do better than the other, they come to talk and open a dialogue, that's where things will happen. So yes, tachlis. Remember this word. It's an important one when you go to Israel. Say tachlis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Go ahead.
You know, I think, first of all, it's important to stress that the relationship for those outside of Israel, Jewish or non-Jewish, supporting Israel, it's important that relationship not be based solely on being behind certain policies or not other policies. It should be, first of all, based upon the strong connection, the core values, for the Jewish communities, obviously, the Jewish state for the Jewish people, and there should be a place, of course, for all Jews in the state of Israel, and an opportunity when there are differences of opinion on policy to voice those differences of opinion. But for the relationship to be based on one policy or another is simply a losing formula, because you're always going to have changes in policies. So it's important to stress that. And I think also that, you know, I was talking about how the relationship between diaspora Jewry and especially the younger generations with Israel has evolved. I know for my generation and certainly older's, it was always one based upon the history of the Holocaust and what came out of Europe. And that's something that's changing for the younger generations. And it's important that the relationships evolve and be based, not, of course, that's a big part of it, and that should always be a part of it, and the history is crucial. But the relationship has to also evolve and be based on other things. And I think, in addition to history and rights, which has always been our narrative, we have to focus on values. And if we stress values, I think that we're going to have more of an opportunity to bridge that gap and to avoid this crisis in 10 years, and to stress the values, and also to stress the fact that Israel is not a perfect country. And we don't always get it right, not in our policies and not in our laws, but to stress the values as a liberal country, as an open country, with respect to freedom and democracy, diversity, and certainly innovation. And those are, and the list goes on, and those are different core values that I think younger generations can connect to. And it's important to understand and to remember and to remind ourselves that Israel did not have a voice 70 years ago, after a couple of thousand years. And now we do have a voice, and again, that voice isn't always perfect, but we can't take that for granted. We have to find ways, creative ways, with the new, more complex world and younger generation. The younger generation is a lot more complex than it used to be, in order to bridge that gap. And just in terms of a couple of practical issues, I mean, we mentioned it, but I think we all know that it's been proven that the most effective the most effective way to reach people in order to better understand Israel and to understand our security challenges and to understand our people and the diversity and the complexity and the political system is visiting Israel. So Birthright really has, despite this growing rift and whatever the numbers show, if you look at the numbers of the cohort of, I think it's 18 to 35 versus the next level, you'll see the great impact, positive impact that's taken place there. So those groups, and you mentioned the non-Jewish groups, there's this program Passages, which also brings young Christian leaders that based on their biblical faith get to see modern Israel and combine that, and also then combined with the Jewish student leaders come back here and serve as ambassadors. And it's important to remind ourselves that this is not just the responsibility of Israel or official Israel, but also the leadership here together. And it's not about pointing the fingers at one or at the other, but it's about working together on these programs. Just as Jonathan mentioned, it's important that these familiarity or education programs are implemented as a two-way street. Yes, I agree, Knesset members, I mean, I mentioned my background. Our ambassador to the United States, currently Ron Dermer, also is American born and raised, and I believe that helps a lot in understanding. You can nod your head, but I think it helps a lot in understanding. Our previous ambassador, Michael Oren, as well, being American.
I know them, I love them, but not even close. Not even close.
I will say, in terms of the work of the Israeli government, there, almost for the first time, there is extensive support through the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs in Israel in terms of an educational campaign for Israelis around what is happening in Jewish communities outside of Israel. So this is almost the first time where Israel is investing Israeli tax money in order to educate Israelis and kind of open up the frame about what's happening outside of Israel, which I think is a huge statement in terms of what Israel is doing, and something that we should definitely, or at least I think, should be supported very much.
And don't get me wrong, Ron, Michael, Dory, they're the best. Don't get me wrong, they're the best. No one else comes close to them, and I think they would admit that being away from the Jewish communities that they grew up in and being away from the politics, especially after the last 12 months, has put them at a disadvantage. So again, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think that they're doing the best with what they've got, but it's a little like me going to Israel 3 times a year and saying, oh, I know Israel. But things are just changing too fast, and what's really going to change in the next 10 years is the pace of accelerating change. I mean, it's just getting faster and faster and faster, and to be 3 steps ahead, which is where diplomats want to be, is going to get harder and harder and harder. I want to also come up with some very specific recommendations, hoping that some of the people in this audience may be in a position to act on them. Words do matter, and there is a place for talk, but talk is not actually the only thing, and it's not necessarily the best thing. I'd say it's necessary, it's not sufficient. So a few years ago, our friends at Makom came up with a brilliant exercise when talking about Israel and the diaspora, hugging and wrestling. It should be hugging, it should be wrestling. Now, I've done both, and I think they're missing something, and it's like partnering. There's a place for hugging, there's a place for wrestling, and there's a place for partnering. And I love the dialogues. In fact, I was so dismayed when one of the best diaspora, Israel diaspora dialogue arena ever created dissipated. I don't know if you even know this. I don't know if anyone here knows this, but there was something called the Moriah process. And UJA invested significant resources picking out all the future leaders of the American Jewish community, and then there was an Israel forum. And they picked out all these up-and-coming leaders. Now, I don't know what's ever happened to them, Ehud Olmert, Ehud Barak, I don't know what's happened to them. These are the people I met with when they were very, very young. And these dialogues went on all day and then into the night, and coffee and scotch and more coffee. And it was really worthwhile. And somewhere along the way, they decided, you know, we've done that and it's no longer novel, let's quit it. That's the kind of talking I'd like, real immersive talking. But in addition to the talking, starting with Americans, Jews and non-Jews visiting Israel, we need better trips. And I have sent my 3 children on the best trips. We need better trips. When I hear that Birthright is reconsidering showing some of the communities of Israel that are less familiar, it's breaking my heart. Because let me tell you something, nothing will estrange our children faster than them realizing you're not presenting the whole thing? Okay, so I want to see better trips, and I've seen some real good progress made in that area, including trips funded by Sheldon Adelson through Campus Maccabees. I mean, it's not brain surgery, but the idea is visit all of Israel, not just selective cherry pick. Are any of you familiar with the magnificent program that Nathan Lowe created years ago, Israel at Heart? So he took 3 gorgeous Israelis, they were boys, girls, they were just effervescent, they were enthusiastic, 0 training in Hasbara, thank God, 0 training in the Arab-Israeli conflict, thank God, 0 training in Startup Nation, they never even read the book, thank God. They simply told their stories, and they went to people's homes, they went to fraternities and sororities, they went to Jewish day schools, they went to Christian churches. It was just people to people, and it was magnificent. And we realized that programs don't engage people nearly as well as people engage people. I'd like to see that expanded. I'd also like to see it in reverse. I think it's time for Israel to bring 3 gorgeous American Jews and non-Jews, frankly, to Israel to do the exact same thing, home hospitality, spend time in the schools, and to do so much of it that real friendships are forged. And there's one other thing I'd like to see. Yom Ha'atzmaut used to be a very, very big deal when we were younger. Now, granted, it was after 67, after 73, there was a lot of tumult after Entebbe. But Yom Ha'atzmaut should not just be a day that comes and goes, which unfortunately is the case for a lot of the Jewish holidays among those who aren't terribly religious. You know, they come, they go, they lose track. Yom Ha'atzmaut should be a very, very, very big deal. And if we were ever going to do it, it would be Israel at 60, Israel at 70, right? Because we're very base 10-centric. But the notion of IAC helping, reminding the American Jewish partners, this is a big, big, big deal. And what a great opportunity to come together and celebrate and celebrate and celebrate. And if you want to talk to each other, talk to each other. You want to go out for drinks, go out for drinks. But what a great opportunity. And then it's going to come around every year. Sort of like Passover, only contemporary. Do you realize that young people know more about ancient Israelites than they do about modern Israelis because they do the Passover Seder, Manischewitz, or all night long, and they don't do anything comparable. So they know Exodus from Egypt, they don't know Exodus is a boat, and 10 years from now, Exodus is going to be like the Trojan horse, or they'll remember it, the Peloponnesian Wars. So IAC is in a position to tip the balance. So let me be very clear. When I say I'm pessimistic 10 years out, I mean if we do nothing. I am not remotely pessimistic when I think about what we can do jointly. The idea is to create disruptions to the trends. So if we literally go home and do nothing, it's probably bad news. If we go home and tap the resources represented here, oh my God, it could change everything.
Amen. Gil, what are your thoughts?
So there are a variety of things that have already been mentioned, which I'm not going to focus on so much, but obviously the people-to-people connections is something that we've all been focusing on a lot. In Washington, we've also been really focused on bringing many more shlichim over so we can have that year-round and bring Israel into a variety of communities, including those that typically, I had a meeting recently with some folks who primarily work with young adults, and she basically said, look, we don't talk about Israel. Israel is not on the table because it causes too much problems. We want to keep people connected, so we just don't talk about Israel. And obviously that's a horrible answer, right? Because the response should not be, it's too hard, let's ignore it. It's a question of how do we effectively have a conversation and bring people in and participate. And it may be finding the right shaliach or shlicha, it may be finding kind of the right way to have a conversation, but having it off the table. And that was actually 2 conversations the same day about similar populations. And so those are just some small things. I want to touch on one larger issue, which we're in the middle of right now, and I don't know what the division is going to be. So we are in a many ways, rapidly changing relationship between Israel and American Jewry. Right, the historical wealthy uncle in the U.S. sending dollars over is long gone. No one even imagines that anymore. The question is, what is next? And in fact, there's a dynamic that I think is flipping, where what is the role of Israeli government? So going back to what is the role of Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people related to American Jewry? We don't have an answer to that yet. I don't think Israel has an answer. I don't think American Jewry understands what that should be. And I don't think either one really understands, in the absence of that definition, of what does it look like when you have two strong centers of Judaism. How do we come together to bring kind of connections and alignment as opposed to distancing? So from the Israeli government, I do think that policies have an impact if there is no relationship. If there's strong love and connection, policies kind of, flow by. But if there isn't, then they matter. And thinking through what are the implications if Israel were to see itself, or the government were to see itself as the leadership and nation state of the Jewish people, what should they do, and how does it affect global Jewry or not? Right? That should be part of the calculation if it is something that is being thought about. And that is really something. So going on to what I think it was Jonathan who said before, of bringing over Knesset members, bringing over leadership so they understand what's going on, so people do feel a sense of broader responsibility. I think that is one very important step for Israeli government leadership. If they only feel responsibility, and they absolutely, they have to, whatever it is, 95% of their role has to be to the Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, but they also have a responsibility in terms of policies beyond that. And particularly as this relationship is changing, we need specific ways to tackle that. For American Jews to think differently about itself and how it connects to Israel, and for the Israeli government and leadership to think about how it connects to American Jewry. The one last thing I want to say is I actually think I wouldn't look at crises as a signal of whether we have a good relationship or not. It's easy to feel close during a crisis, right? Jewry will come together when there's a war, when there's something going on. That's the easy time to a certain extent. I don't think that's the hard time. It's the hard time when there is an absence of crisis, when the question is, what are we about day to day? How do we support each other? How do we work with each other? Do we actually even care and think about the other? And it's going to be all these small things, people to people, connections, getting people to understand the other in deep, complex ways that is going to change it. Because otherwise, I do worry, along the line of Jonathan, that slowly but slowly, younger people in particular who didn't grow up, kind of as you said, pre-67 or 73. I think, 82, I think there was a shift. Up until then, I think there was a different dynamic. And so those are things that we need to struggle with because I do worry about the future.
So, thank you, Gil. One additional thought before we open it up to questions. There is, I would say, one additional practical recommendation which I find very useful. And that is that, from my experience, the greatest untapped potential that currently exists in the Jewish world, and it's interesting that we're sitting here in this conference, is the Israeli-American community and the Olim community in Israel. Why are these such huge untapped potentials? Because these are individuals who can serve as living bridges. So everyone here talked about people-to-people connections. And I agree that the strongest thing that we have in order to bridge the gap is what we call the mifgash, the encounter. But encounters, and they are important, don't get me wrong, and we need more of them in terms of quality and in terms of quantity. But they are very expensive, and they are very long, or far apart, let's call it that way. We have two populations in the Jewish world that embody that mifgash by virtue of the fact that they get the nuances of different communities. And again, I'm talking about second-generation Israelis that live in the US or in Jewish communities outside of Israel, and Olim that have come and live in Israel. And if we are more intentional, communally intentional, about engaging these populations and creating these mifgashim, these encounters, in our own backyards, I think we could be making a lot of progress. Okay, We have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question, there's a microphone over there. You're welcome to please. What's that? And we have a lot of mics here if that doesn't work. Please state your name, and I will just ask that your statement ends with a question mark.
Sure. My name is Charnay. I'm here with Passages from Los Angeles. And as I heard a concept today of peoplehood, and in thinking about 10 years, peoplehood, the rift, and the American Jew, and the millennials, all of those coming together, my question is, how is technology viewed as a bridge to help regenerate that rift that we've spoken about?
So definitely technology and the fact that Israel is considered to be a startup nation and so amazingly involved with all the high tech and everything that's going on should definitely be a part of it. And what we do in the ISC is we're trying to bring exactly that part of the Israeliness into the community. And the bridge is being done by using what Israel has to offer and what actually Israel has to gain from the relationships here. And I hope that's what you mean. But we do have programs that are geared absolutely for that. And it's for teens, and it's for college students, and we see an incredible success when it comes to connecting it through the high-tech world.
The other part is, what we have found, at least, I mean, my previous life, I was in Boston before I went to Washington. Yes, I was. And especially on the people-to-people stuff, it was great as a secondary tool once you had a relationship. I mean, if you're trying to use it and leverage and continuing technology in a variety of ways to deepen over time. So it was part of a larger way to build connections, because we know travel, look, I mean, for all of us, that's the gold standard, right? One way or the other, you take people, you see it, you experience, you touch, and that's not always possible. So how do you leverage that? And it's also, how do you sustain a relationship, whether it's birthright 10 days or a mission or whatever, and technology can play a very important role there. But at least what I have seen primarily is that one of the key first steps to really understand is being on the ground and then using it to deepen and make connections over time.
More questions? I would say if either hold on to a mic or line up so that maybe we'll take a couple of questions and then we'll let you all, so that we have more time to hear the audience.
So I want to go back to a comment that was made about the lack of knowledge of Israelis, of diaspora Jewry, and the lack of understanding of the impacts of what happens in Israel for diaspora Jews. Particularly focusing on the fact that for many Jews, they don't realize that there is an impact until after they make Aliyah, because they go from being Jewish enough for Aliyah to now they're not Jewish enough. Particularly with the fact that even though we don't think about what happens in the Rabbanut, it does impact the decisions of the diaspora rabbinical councils. So how would you go about educating, particularly diaspora Jews, on how exactly those decisions are disseminated and affect the decisions in diaspora rabbinical councils?
Thank you. We'll take one more question and then we'll let them respond.
We're talking about rifts and distance. I'm wondering about thoughts regarding education and if one had the potential to insert an idea into every educator in this country about how to build connections with Israel. I would be interested in hearing what would that idea be from the different panelists.
Thank you. Who would like to respond?
I'll address the first question about the impacts of decisions made in Israel. I agree with you. I think that, first of all, official Israel, part of what I do, and the various agencies that work with us, whether it's the Jewish Agency or Bayit Israeli or others, together with relevant Jewish organizations, need to do a better job educating and getting the word out in terms of process, everything that has to do with the Aliyah process, and how these different decisions impact whether it's making Aliyah and getting citizenship. And I mean, I know from having to explain about the just proposed laws, even that haven't been passed, about conversion laws, even to colleagues, I'll admit that there's a lot of confusion about, you know, what it impacted and what the scope of the decision was, and whether we're talking about citizenship, whether we're talking about a right of return, marriage, and I can give you the whole history, but it's a whole long lesson. But the point is that it is very complex, even for those that deal with it on a daily basis. And I think that it's something that the different institutions, starting with official Israel, need to do a much better job with in terms of educating.
Can I take it to a little bit of a more personal side of it? I mean, I don't want to get into the political aspect of it and all the, you know, decisions are being made in Israel. In Hebrew say katonti, I'm too small to discuss that. It's, you know, it's a much bigger issue. When I talked about the lack of education of Israelis about the diaspora Jews and vice versa, it wasn't from a religious point of view necessarily. It was the lack of understanding of how much we actually need each other. And I know it's hard for a lot of you to use the word rift, but I think that's exactly part of it, that we separated so much that we no longer understand how valuable we are for each other. So going back to your question about education, I mean, this is where it should start. It's really bringing everybody to the basic and almost like starting from scratch and teaching a kid to crawl and then walk. We forgot. We got to a point when it's very sad. And the reason why I'm a little bit more optimistic is because I look at you and I look at the young crowd here and I'm thinking, you actually care. You're willing to start crawling and walking with us, and we need you. So, so again, it's about the education. It's about trying to explain the value that we have for each other, and we can do it.
On the education question?
One second. Let's take the question because I think it's related, and then we'll do it all together. Go ahead.
Mine isn't so much a question. Yes, it is a question to Sam. Years ago, I worked for the Israeli consulate in New York for the Department of Academic Affairs. I don't know if you remember me, Jonathan, Cheryl Silverman. And one of the most important things that we did, the most invaluable hasbara that came out of there, was a mishlachat noar, the creme de la creme of Israeli youth that came to the United States, and I coordinated this program. It went to each consulate was responsible for a group of great kids who went to the communities in the respective areas. They spoke to high schools, to their peers. They were interviewed in the community. They spoke to synagogues. It was the best hasbara. It enabled, American youth to meet the Israeli youth, and vice versa. So you open the eyes of the Jewish Americans here, whoever, and have them discover, also their peers, and the Israeli youth can discover what life in America is like.
Can I just ask that you ask it as a question?
What I wanted to understand was, I just needed to preface it. Do you still have that program? Or if you don't, I would highly recommend reinstating it and including Israeli Arabs that are Zionists, because I see a lot of PR now, and I know there is a group of Israeli Arabs touring the country. To me, that's the best hasbara, and showing how the Israeli Arabs and the Israeli youth can work together and show the BDS movement and everybody else positive hasbara. To me, that was the most invaluable thing. Forget about all the other stuff. That is, to me, what the focus is.
Thank you.
Can I speak to that briefly?
Yeah, and then Jonathan, go ahead.
So just quickly on that point, first of all, Cheryl, thank you for your service in the consulate in New York. I know what we pay in our consulate, so that's why I say thank you for your service. It's a great point, and I can tell you that Netaly touched on this point earlier when she mentioned the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs under Minister Netaly Bennett, who's here at this conference, I believe. Part of the funding that they've set aside is specifically for summer camp programs. And I know how important summer camp programs are. By the way, last Sunday, I rode 100 kilometers on a bike event for the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles to raise money to help send toward the summer camps, to send, because it's been proven also that Jewish children who grow up with a Jewish/Israeli, not necessarily Israeli, but the Jewish summer program or camp experience have a stronger Jewish identity and therefore a stronger connection with Israel. And I think that your point is very important because we've heard a lot about bringing folks. I mean, we talked obviously about groups to Israel, but we've talked a lot about bringing Israelis over and Knesset members and educating them. But I can't stress enough that it's got to be a two-way street. And I think that the summer program of bringing Israelis over here and having them interact is a very effective program, and that is something that the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs has set money aside for. And I wouldn't even necessarily consider it hasbara. I think it's just important for this joint, mutual education and mutual familiarity. So absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan, and feel free to respond to all the
every question that's been asked for the last 4 days.
Exactly.
Well, first of all, I love that thought exercise. If you could inject one idea into the schools, I'm going to interpret that as injecting one idea into the Jewish day schools as a starting point. I think I do have an idea that I'd like to see injected. Not only would I let American Jewish young people know that Israel's not perfect, I'd emphasize that Israel is not done and that Israel needs their help. And I'd remind them that in 1969, an Israeli journalist went to see David Ben Gurion in stable care, and somewhat cynically said, "So, how's this thing going for you? Light unto the nations?" And Ben Gurion said, "Not yet." He wasn't defensive. He didn't make the case that it was better than Egypt or better than Western Europe, let alone other. He said, "Not yet." And what I would ask the American Jewish young people to consider as they make their transition to college is there is a choice, implicit, if not explicit. They want to be involved with the people bettering Israel or battering Israel, because that's what it's going to come down to. I don't want people to say Israel's not perfect to then walk away thinking we've covered it, right? Because when people say America's not perfect, I just as soon read the indictment. I'm serious. I want my children to know exactly what the responsibility is to improve America. And the same for Israel. When my kids go to Israel, they're not looking for Jewish Disneyland. In fact, if I tell my kids, Israel is so much better than any other country on these things that you as a progressive care about, they'll say, then you don't need my help. Then I'll go elsewhere. I'd rather say, no, Israel is hurting, because Israel is a baby in terms of nation years. And do you want to beat up on Israel? It's kind of an easy target. Or do you want to better Israel? Because that's going to use that's going to really require some serious engagement.
So, and I think that's exactly right. And we were just in Israel on a mission, and part of it, and people were upset about kind of the Kotel agreement, the conversion bill, a variety of things, and we were in a conversation, and basically the response was, look, you can either object and yell and be angry, or be in the conversation, join and raise the issues and talk about it and argue, and not abandon and push, because this is a process. This is an effort to try to figure out what is this combination of Israel, which is a country for people who live there, and a nation state that includes people who don't live there. And it's complicated. We don't have models for it around the world. We don't know what that looks like, where we have that dual responsibility. And so as we're trying to think about that, as trying to make sense of that, it is something that we need to be in the conversation. I think both for American Jewry and for the Israeli government, what are the decisions that we make that will either bring us closer together or push us further apart? And that has to be part of the conversation. And it won't be by simple answers. It won't be by simple trips. It's going to be by forcing each other to struggle with the vision of the other and what we're trying to do and how we want to move forward. And at the end of the day, the more we're open to that, the more we're saying, join me in my living room for this conversation, the better it is. And if we, don't do that, then we will increasingly have this gap and this rift and this crisis in the future, even if it doesn't exist right now. And so that's really my hope for this whole process.
I'm afraid that we're at the end of our time. I want to offer one final thought before we break. At the heart of every strong relationship and every strong family is love, right? At the end of the day, it's love. And the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And so, we're talking to the people who are in the room, but what I think is most significant are actually the people who are not in the room. And when we look at the future of the Jewish people and the future of this relationship, I think that a lot of it lies on getting the people who are out of the room into the room in whatever way that we can possibly do. And I think a lot of good ideas came up here, and there are many more. And I think that if we all work together, then hopefully we will be able to bridge the gap as opposed to widen it. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to our panelists.